Hello everyone and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight we're traveling to the mountains of North Carolina, where the Blue Ridge peaks stretch toward darkening skies and remote cabins sit nestled among the pines. This is a story about a family that fractured, a father and daughter whose relationship grew complicated in isolation, and a single afternoon in February that changed everything. Michael Joseph Howell was 50 years old in the winter of 2014. For years he'd made his living as a sports editor for the Columbia County News-Times, spending his days crafting headlines and shaping stories about local athletes and Friday night football games. He was the kind of man who understood small-town life, who knew that sports could bind a community together, that a well-written game recap might be the highlight of someone's breakfast table reading. But by 2014, Michael's life had shifted away from newsrooms and deadline pressures. After his divorce from Christina Rester in the late 2000s, he'd retreated to a sprawling 8-bedroom cabin in the Sheepback Mountain community near Maggie Valley, North Carolina. The property was remote, perched high where the air grew thin and cold, where neighbors were scarce and privacy was abundant. The cabin had been meant as a vacation home, a place to escape to. Instead, it became Michael's full-time residence. He wasn't alone. His daughter Crystal had come to live with him after the divorce, when she was just 12 years old. For 5 years, the two shared that mountain home, father and daughter navigating life together in the isolation of those wooded heights. Crystal Brooke Howell had been 12 when her parents' marriage ended. Like many children of divorce, she'd been caught in the middle of adult decisions, her life reshaped by circumstances beyond her control. When the family split, Crystal went to live with her father, while her younger sister remained with their mother in Augusta, Georgia. The years that followed weren't easy. Crystal had what family members later described as a tough upbringing. She struggled with authority, pushing against boundaries in ways that created friction with both parents. There were behavioral issues, signs that something deeper troubled her. At 12, she began counseling. Eventually, she was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, a condition marked by instability in moods, relationships, and self-image. The diagnosis suggested a young woman grappling with impulses she couldn't always control, emotions that shifted like mountain weather. Living in that remote cabin with her father, Crystal was isolated from peers, from the daily rhythms of school life that might have anchored her. The distance between their home and town meant that every errand, every social interaction, required deliberate effort. Father and daughter had each other, but sometimes closeness can breed tension rather than comfort. Family members would later speak carefully about those years. Crystal's aunt mentioned that there were issues, complications that had compounded over time. She insisted that Crystal wasn't a monster, that the story was more complex than it might appear. But whatever troubles existed within that cabin, they remained largely private, hidden behind the tree line and the mountain's quiet. The day began ordinarily enough. It was Monday, February 24th, and the mountain air carried the last bite of winter. Michael and Crystal drove down from Sheepback Mountain to the Ingalls grocery store in Canton. Surveillance cameras captured them that afternoon, moving through the aisles together, just a father and daughter running errands, shopping for whatever provisions they needed for the coming week. But something happened during that trip. Crystal attempted to shoplift something from the store. The details of what she tried to take have never been made fully public, but Michael caught her in the act. For a father, especially one who'd worked in journalism and valued integrity, the disappointment must have been sharp. For a 17-year-old already struggling with authority and boundaries, being caught must have felt like humiliation. They drove back to the cabin together, the silence between them heavy with Michael's disapproval, and Crystal's shame. When they arrived home, Michael was exhausted. Perhaps from the confrontation, perhaps from the general weight of raising a troubled teenager alone on that mountain. He lay down on the couch in the living room to take a nap. Crystal went to take a shower. The water ran hot, steam filling the bathroom as she stood beneath the spray. And according to what she would later tell investigators, it was there, in that enclosed space with water pounding around her, that her thoughts turned dark. She thought about what had happened at the store. She thought about her father's disappointments. She thought about her life, trapped on this mountain with nowhere to go and no way out. And she thought about killing him. When Crystal emerged from the shower, something had crystallized in her mind. She moved through the cabin with purpose now, wet hair dripping onto her shoulders. She knew where her father kept a shotgun. It wasn't unusual for a family in rural North Carolina to have firearms in the house, especially this far from town where response times for emergencies could stretch long. Michael was still asleep on the couch, his breathing slow and steady. He had no idea his daughter was approaching. No warning of what came next. Crystal raised the shotgun and aimed it at his head. There was no confrontation, no final words exchanged, just a single shot that echoed through the empty cabin and ended Michael Howell's life instantly. In that moment, everything changed. Crystal had acted on an impulse that she'd never be able to take back. Years later, she would claim on a podcast that there'd been no thinking, that it happened too fast for contemplation. But prosecutors would paint a different picture, describing how she'd pondered the act while showering, how she'd made a conscious choice and then executed it with cold precision. Either way, when the sound of the gunshot faded, 50-year-old Michael Howell was dead on his own couch, killed by his own daughter in his own home. Now Crystal faced a new reality. Her father's body lay before her, undeniable evidence of what she'd done. Many teenagers might have panicked, might have called the police in a state of shock or remorse. Crystal did neither. Instead, she began to cover her tracks with methodical care. First, she had to deal with the couch itself, soaked now with her father's blood. She managed to get it out of the house and dispose of it, though the specifics of how a 17-year-old girl moved that heavy piece of furniture remain unclear. Then came the body itself. Crystal found a large plastic storage container, and through means that require imagination to comprehend, she placed her father's body inside it. She wrapped him in a sleeping bag, leaving him dressed in the same clothes he'd worn to the grocery store that morning. Then she carried or dragged the container out to the property's storage shed, where she hid it among whatever else was stored there. The shotgun that she'd used had to go too. Crystal sold it, turning the murder weapon into cash that would help her maintain the life she was about to construct. With the physical evidence hidden or disposed of, Crystal began building her story. She contacted friends with devastating news. Her father had gone to Georgia and committed suicide. The story was plausible enough. Michael had been divorced, had been living in isolation. Depression could strike anyone. Her friends had no reason to doubt her, no cause to question the word of someone they knew. What followed was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire case. For nearly a month, Crystal lived freely in her father's cabin, with his body hidden mere yards away in the storage shed. She didn't quietly grieve or live in fearful isolation. Instead, she transformed the house into something her father would never have permitted. She invited friends to move in with her. The isolated cabin that had been home to just father and daughter suddenly hosted multiple teenagers, free from adult supervision. Crystal began spending Michael's money, accessing whatever accounts and cash he'd left behind. She drove his distinctive orange Land Rover wherever she pleased, no longer constrained by his or disapproval. The cabin became a venue for parties. According to prosecutors, these were drug-fueled gatherings, the kind that would have horrified Michael had he been alive to witness them. At some point during this month, Crystal even had a stripper pole installed in the kitchen. The image is jarring, almost absurd. A piece of equipment more suited to a nightclub appearing in a family home where a murdered man's body lay hidden just outside. To those who visited during this time, everything seemed fine. Crystal appeared to be a teenager finally experiencing freedom. She told anyone who asked that her father had released her from his custody, that he'd moved on with his life and left her to live her own. She made it all seem normal, reasonable even. But in the shed, wrapped in that sleeping bag inside the plastic container, Michael Howell's body remained, a secret that couldn't stay hidden forever. March 22, 2014. Nearly a month had passed since Michael's death. Some of Crystal's friends were at the cabin, and they decided to move a pinball machine into the storage shed. It was just a casual task, the kind of thing you do when you're young and living in a house with space to spare. But when they opened the shed and began moving things around to make room for the pinball machine, they found the plastic container. Perhaps curiosity got the better of them, or perhaps something about it seemed wrong. When they opened it, they discovered Michael Howell's body. The discovery must have been horrifying. To find a corpse is traumatic enough, but to realize it's the father of your friend, a man you may have known, a man who'd been missing for weeks while you'd been partying in his house, the psychological impact would have been enormous. The friends immediately called the Waynesville Police Department. Within hours, the cabin was transformed into a crime scene. Officers and investigators swarmed the property, documenting everything, photographing the shed, beginning the process of unraveling what had happened. Crystal wasn't at the cabin when her friends made their discovery. Just 3 days earlier, on March 19th, she'd called her mother, Christina, in Augusta, Georgia. She told Christina that Michael had released her from his custody and that she wanted to move back home. Christina, being a responsible parent, had told her daughter she'd need proof of emancipation before allowing such a move. But Crystal hadn't let that deter her. On March 22nd, the same day her friends found her father's body, Crystal showed up at Christina's house in Augusta. She was driving Michael's orange Land Rover and towing a U-Haul trailer packed with her belongings. She'd taken $3,000 in cash from the cabin. She'd even told one of her friends to stay behind and keep paying the bills on the property. Crystal didn't make it far. The police in North Carolina quickly identified her as a suspect. And by March 23rd, just 1 day after her father's body was discovered, officers tracked her down to a Motel 6 in Richmond County, Georgia. She was taken into custody without incident. During questioning, Crystal's story began to unravel. At first, she claimed it had been an accident, that the shotgun safety had malfunctioned, but investigators knew better. The evidence didn't support an accidental discharge, especially not one that resulted in Michael being shot in the head while he slept. Eventually, Crystal admitted the truth. She told them about being caught shoplifting at Ingalls. She told them about returning home and taking a shower. She told them about thinking about killing her father. And she told them about walking out of that bathroom, taking the shotgun, and shooting him while he napped on the couch. The autopsy confirmed what they already knew. Michael had died from a single shotgun wound to the head. There were no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds. He'd been killed in his sleep, unaware of what was coming. Crystal was extradited back to North Carolina and taken to the Haywood County Detention Center. There she would remain for the next 2.5 years, while her case slowly moved through the legal system. The case against Crystal Brooke Howell was straightforward in its facts, but complicated in its implications. She was charged with first-degree murder, concealment of death, and failure to report a death not from natural causes. First-degree murder in North Carolina implies premeditation, the kind of planning and forethought that distinguishes it from crimes of passion or accidents. Prosecutors believed they had clear evidence of premeditation. Crystal had admitted to thinking about killing her father while she showered. She'd then emerged from the bathroom, retrieved the weapon, and carried out the act. The shooting itself might have taken only seconds, but those moments in the shower, those thoughts turning over in her mind, that was where the murder truly began. After the killing, Crystal had shown clear consciousness of guilt through her cover-up efforts. She'd hidden the body, disposed of evidence, sold the murder weapon, and lied to everyone about what had happened. She'd spent a month living freely while keeping her father's corpse hidden. To prosecutors, these actions demonstrated not just guilt, but a calculating coldness. Crystal's defense attorney, Bridget Aguirre, took a different approach. She emphasized her client's mental health history, the borderline personality disorder diagnosis, the years of counseling, the instability that had marked Crystal's teenage years. The defense wasn't arguing that Crystal was innocent, but rather that context mattered. A troubled 17-year-old with documented mental health issues had made a terrible decision in a moment of emotional turmoil. District Attorney Ashley Welch, however, countered that Crystal's actions after the murder told the real story. The month of parties, the spending of her father's money, the stripper pole in the kitchen. These weren't the actions of someone overwhelmed by mental illness. These were the actions of someone who wanted freedom at any cost. Someone willing to kill to live life on her own terms. On October 10th, 2016, 2.5 years after Michael Howell's death, Crystal Brooke Howell appeared in Haywood County Superior Court. She stood before the judge in her prison clothes, unshackled, her voice barely above a whisper as she pleaded guilty to all charges. There would be no trial, no jury deliberation. Crystal was accepting responsibility for what she'd done. Whether this came from genuine remorse, practical calculation, or legal advice, only she could say. Her mother, Christina, sat in the courtroom with Crystal's younger sister, Sierra. They held each other and quietly sobbed as Crystal admitted her guilt. Whatever complicated feelings they had, watching a daughter and sister confess to murder, they had to process them in that public space. The sentencing came swiftly. For the concealment charges, Crystal received 60 to 84 months in prison. For the murder itself, she received a minimum of 25 years to be served after the initial sentence. In total, she would need to serve approximately 30 years before becoming eligible for parole. She received credit for the 32 days she'd already spent in pretrial confinement. The judge addressed Crystal directly before pronouncing sentence. He told her that taking responsibility was the first step toward moving forward, toward any possibility of healing. He read from a statement Christina had written, words expressing that she wouldn't give up on her daughter, that she hoped Crystal would find peace with help and counseling. Assistant District Attorney Jeff Jones summarized the state's case one final time. Crystal had been caught shoplifting, had thought about killing her father while showering, and had then executed him while he slept. She'd hidden the body, dumped the couch, sold the gun, and covered up the crime for more than a month. It was calculated. It was cold. It was murder, in the first degree. District Attorney Ashley Welch spoke to the motive behind it all. The shocking part wasn't just that a young woman had killed her father, but that she'd then spent his money, used his house, drove his car, all while his body lay hidden. She'd wanted to live on her own terms, and Michael Howell's life had been the price. Crystal's aunt, Brenda Ellis, spoke to reporters afterward. She insisted there was more to Crystal than had come out in court, that there had been so many issues compounding over the years. She said Crystal wasn't a monster, that the whole thing was a heartbreaking tragedy, but what those additional issues were, she didn't specify. Crystal Brooke Howell was transferred to the North Carolina Department of Adult Corrections, where she would serve her sentence. Eventually, she was housed at the Anson Correctional Institution in Polkton, North Carolina. There, she would spend her 20s and much of her 30s, assuming she serves the full minimum sentence before parole. In 2023, nearly a decade after her father's death, Crystal participated in a podcast series titled Killing Dad, a First-Degree Mistake. It was the first time she'd spoken publicly about the case. Now 26 years old, she offered a different version of events than the one presented in court. She claimed she'd never sat there and thought about killing anyone, or hurting anyone. She insisted it happened so fast there was no thinking, that it was basically an impulse. This contradicted the prosecution's case, and her own earlier statements about contemplating the act while showering. She also denied killing her father for money or freedom, saying that authorities wanted to believe that narrative because it made it easier to put a child in prison for life. The podcast promised to present previously unknown information, to include perspectives from friends who'd moved into the cabin and discovered the body, even to reveal details about an alleged accomplice who helped dispose of evidence. It asked listeners to decide for themselves whether Crystal deserved the lengthy sentence she'd received, noting that there's no nationwide standard for sentencing teenagers who commit murder. Michael Howell's family has largely remained out of the public eye. Christina Rester, who lost her ex-husband and saw her daughter imprisoned, has had to navigate grief and loss in ways few can imagine. Crystal's younger sister, Sierra, has had to process the knowledge that her sibling killed their father. The ripples of that February afternoon have spread outward, affecting everyone who knew the Howell family. The case of Crystal Brooke Howell and Michael Howell raises questions that have no easy answers. What happens when mental illness intersects with adolescence? How do we understand impulse versus premeditation in the teenage brain? When does a troubled child become a criminal who must be held accountable? The mountains of North Carolina still stand, unchanging despite the violence that occurred there. The cabin on Sheepback Mountain has passed to other hands. The Ingalls grocery store in Canton continues its daily business. Though surveillance footage from that February afternoon remains part of a murder file, Crystal sits in prison, serving a sentence that will likely keep her incarcerated until she's well into her 40s. Michael Howell rests in a grave, his life cut short at 50. His death at the hands of the daughter he'd raised alone for 5 years. The truth lies somewhere in the complicated space between the prosecution's narrative of a calculated killer and the defense's portrait of a troubled teen, making an impulsive, terrible choice. Perhaps it's both. Perhaps it's neither. Perhaps it's something else entirely that we, looking in from the outside, can never fully understand. But this much remains clear. On February 24, 2014, a father took a nap on his couch and never woke up. A daughter made a choice that destroyed 2 lives. Her father's and, in many ways, her own. And in the silence of a mountain cabin, a family ended. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight we're traveling to a small Oklahoma town where a gesture of kindness would become a fatal mistake. This is a story about young love gone wrong, about jealousy, violence, and a confession that shocked a community. So as we settle in, let me tell you about what happened on a June night in Henrietta, Oklahoma, when 23-year-old Anthony Hall's life came to a tragic end. Henrietta, Oklahoma sits in the southern part of Okmulgee County, about 50 miles south of Tulsa. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where generations of families have built their lives around coal mines, oil fields, and the land itself. Founded in the late 1800s, when Hugh Henry discovered coal deposits on Creek Nation land, the town grew into a modest community that once boasted dozens of mines and thousands of workers. By 2015, it had settled into the quiet rhythm of small-town life, with the population hovering around 6,000 souls. Jim Anthony Hall, though most people just called him Anthony, was born on November 10th, 1991 in nearby Okmulgee. His parents were Jim Rhodes and Linda Ann Wilder Hanson, and he grew up in Henrietta, attending the local public schools alongside kids he'd known since kindergarten. Anthony's childhood wasn't without its sorrows. He lost his sister Holly at some point during his young life, a loss that shaped him in ways only his closest family members could truly understand. As a young boy, Anthony was like so many others in Henrietta. He knew the back roads, the fishing spots, the shortcuts through town that only locals recognize. For about 4 years, his family moved to Iowa, giving him a broader perspective on life beyond Oklahoma's borders. But eventually, they returned to Henrietta, drawn back to the familiar red clay soil and the community they'd always called home. By 23, Anthony had become a young man trying to find his way in life. His sister Amanda Feldpausch would later describe him as a good kid, someone with a kind heart who was still figuring things out. Like many young people in small towns, he worked local jobs, hung out with friends, and tried to navigate the complexities of early adulthood. Those who knew him said he was generous, the kind of person who'd help you move furniture or lend you his last $20 without thinking twice about it. And it was this generosity, this fundamental kindness in his nature, that would ultimately lead to his death. Anthony met Samantha Stancifer when they were both young. He was around 20, she was 17. Their relationship began the way many first loves do, with intensity and passion. The kind of connection that feels all-consuming when you're that age. For Anthony, Samantha was his first serious girlfriend, his first real taste of what he thought love might be. For Samantha, Anthony represented something she latched onto with a fierce, possessive grit. But from the beginning, those closest to Anthony could see that something wasn't quite right. His sister Amanda watched as the relationship unfolded over the next 3 years. And what she saw troubled her. The couple was constantly breaking up and getting back together. caught in a cycle that never seemed to resolve itself. They'd be apart for weeks, sometimes months, and then suddenly they'd be together again, as if the problems that drove them apart had never existed. Amanda and other family members described the relationship as toxic. There were arguments, dramatic confrontations, and a possessiveness on Samantha's part that went beyond normal jealousy. In 2013, 2 years before Anthony's death, Samantha was actually arrested for domestic abuse, assault, and battery. The details of that incident weren't widely publicized, but it should have been a warning sign, a red flag that this relationship had the potential for violence. Yet Anthony kept going back. Maybe it was because Samantha was his first love. And first loves have a way of blinding us to reality. Maybe he thought he could fix whatever was broken between them. Or maybe, like so many people caught in toxic relationships, he couldn't quite see how dangerous things had become. He told his sister Amanda at one point that he knew the relationship wasn't good for him, that he should have ended it a long time ago. But knowing something intellectually and being able to act on it emotionally are two very different things. By the spring of 2015, Anthony and Samantha had broken up yet again. This time, it seemed more final. Anthony, now 23, was trying to move forward with his life. He was living in his house on the south side of Henrietta, a modest place on West Dixie Street where he was trying to build some independence and figure out his future. But Samantha was 20 years old and had nowhere to go. This is where Anthony's kindness enters the story, in a tragic way. Despite everything that had happened between them, despite the toxicity, the drama, the previous domestic violence incident, Anthony offered to let Samantha stay at his house temporarily. It would just be for a couple of weeks, he told his family, just until she could figure out her living situation and find somewhere else to go. His sister Amanda would later describe this as a kind gesture, which it was. Anthony saw someone he'd once cared about in a difficult situation, and his instinct was to help. He probably thought that because they were broken up, because their romantic relationship was over, they could maintain some kind of civil, temporary arrangement. He likely believed he was doing the right thing, the decent thing. Samantha moved her belongings into Anthony's house sometime in early June 2015. On the surface, they maintained the pretense of being exes who were simply helping each other out. But beneath that surface, emotions were still raw. Samantha hadn't truly accepted that the relationship was over. And as the days passed, she watched Anthony with the kind of attention that comes from unresolved feelings and possessive jealousy. The evening of June 13, 2015 was warm, as Oklahoma summer nights tend to be. Anthony and Samantha went to a party together. Whether as friends or something more ambiguous isn't entirely clear. But they were together, moving through the same social circles they'd always inhabited, seeing the same people they'd known for years. At some point during the party, Samantha glanced at Anthony's phone. What she saw there sent a jolt of fury through her. Text messages. Messages from another girl. In Samantha's mind, this was proof of betrayal. Evidence that Anthony had moved on or was trying to move on. That maybe he'd been talking to this other girl even before their breakup became official. An argument erupted. The details of what was said that night were lost to the chaos of the moment. But witnesses later confirmed that Samantha and Anthony left the party together, tension crackling between them. They drove back to Anthony's house on West Dixie Street, where the walls held the history of their relationship, the good times and the bad, the laughter and the screaming matches. Once inside the house, something strange happened. The argument seemed to dissipate. Maybe Anthony, exhausted by the drama, just wanted peace. Maybe he apologized for whatever Samantha thought he'd done wrong. Maybe they both simply ran out of energy for fighting. They went to Anthony's bedroom. He changed into comfortable clothes, ready to sleep off the night's tension. Samantha was there too, and as the adrenaline of anger faded, they both began to settle down. Anthony climbed into bed. His breathing slowed. His eyes grew heavy. Samantha lay beside him, but sleep didn't come as easily for her. Her mind was still racing, still churning over those text messages she'd seen. Who was this other girl? What had Anthony said to her? How long had this been going on? She picked up Anthony's phone again. In the dim light of the bedroom, she scrolled through the messages, and there they were. More texts from the same girl. Fresh ones, perhaps sent while they were at the party or on the drive home. Each message felt like a knife to Samantha's heart, feeding the jealous rage that had been building inside her all evening. Anthony's breathing had become deep and rhythmic beside her. He was asleep, vulnerable, completely unaware of the storm brewing in the woman lying next to him. Samantha got up. She told herself she was going to the kitchen to get a drink of water. Her feet carried her down the hallway, away from the bedroom where Anthony slept. She entered the kitchen, and in the darkness she saw them lying on the counter. 2 kitchen knives. Later in her confession to police, Samantha would claim that seeing those knives sparked the decision. The text messages recovered from her phone in the days following the murder would tell a different story, in messages sent to a friend days before June 14th. Samantha had written about Anthony. She'd said she would either get him put in jail or kill him. The prosecution would later argue that this proved premeditation, that the murder wasn't a spontaneous act of passion, but something she'd been contemplating for days. Standing in that kitchen, Samantha picked up both knives. The weight of them in her hands should have given her pause. She should have set them down, walked back to the bedroom, and left the house in the morning. But she did. She gripped the handles tighter and walked back toward the bedroom where Anthony slept, completely trusting and completely defenseless. What happened next was savage beyond comprehension. Samantha entered the bedroom where Anthony lay sleeping, and she began to stab him. The first blow might have woken him, might have given him a split second to realize what was happening. But there was no escape, no time to defend himself. She struck again and again and again. The attack was frenzied and brutal. Samantha stabbed Anthony 58 times. She struck his head, his face, his neck, his torso. The knives rose and fell with mechanical repetition. Driven by a rage that had consumed all reason, she slashed his throat to ensure he was dead. And then in an act of horrifying mutilation, she castrated him. The bedroom became a slaughterhouse. Her blood soaked the bed, the walls, the floor. One investigator who worked the case would later say it was the worst crime scene he'd ever encountered in his career. And this was a man who'd seen his share of violence and death. Anthony Hall, the 23-year-old who'd offered his ex-girlfriend a place to stay out of kindness, died in his own bed, killed by someone he'd once loved. In the aftermath of the murder, Samantha's behavior was chilling in its calmness. She was covered in Anthony's blood from head to toe, her clothes saturated, her hands sticky with it, but instead of fleeing or breaking down, she did something that would make this case infamous beyond the borders of Oklahoma. She updated her Facebook status. In the age of social media, where people share their breakfast choices and vacation photos, Samantha chose to share her crime. She typed out a simple message. "I did it. He deserved it." This was how Anthony's sister Amanda found out that her brother was dead. She was scrolling through Facebook when she saw Samantha's post, and in that moment, her world shattered. She immediately tried to reach Anthony, but there was no answer. The terrible truth was settling over her even as she frantically tried to deny it. After posting to Facebook, Samantha picked up the phone and called 911. The call was recorded, and in it, her voice was eerily flat, devoid of emotion. "I killed my boyfriend," she told the dispatcher, and then she added something that suggested, perhaps, that some part of her realized what she'd done. "And now I can't kill myself." Henrietta police officers arrived at the house on West Dixie Street within minutes. When they pulled up, they found Samantha standing outside, drenched in blood. It was on her face, in her hair, soaking through her clothes. She looked like something out of a horror movie, but her demeanor was unnervingly calm. "I killed him," she told the officers. "I killed Anthony Hall." Inside the house, the officers found a scene of unspeakable carnage. Anthony's body lay in the bedroom, mutilated beyond recognition. The violence of the attack was immediately apparent. This hadn't been a single moment of lost control. This had been sustained, methodical brutality. Samantha was arrested on the spot and charged with first-degree murder. As officers placed her in handcuffs and led her to the patrol car, family members who'd heard about the Facebook post began arriving at the scene. Amanda Feldpausch came with other relatives, desperate for information, hoping against hope that it was all some terrible mistake. But it wasn't a mistake. Her brother was gone, killed in the most violent way imaginable. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation was called in to assist Henrietta police with the case. Given the brutality of the crime and the fact that Samantha had confessed both on social media and to the 911 dispatcher, the investigation was relatively straightforward in terms of establishing guilt. But investigators wanted to understand the full scope of what had happened. They searched Anthony's house, collecting evidence and documenting the crime scene. They retrieved both knives that had been used in the attack. They photographed the bedroom, capturing images that would later be used in court to demonstrate the sheer savagery of the assault. Investigators also seized Anthony's phone and Samantha's phone. What they found on Samantha's device was particularly damning. In the days leading up to the murder, she'd sent text messages to a friend that revealed her state of mind. She'd written that she would either get Anthony put in jail or kill him. This evidence would prove crucial in establishing that the murder wasn't a spontaneous act of passion, but something Samantha had been contemplating. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Rob Barris, began building their case. They interviewed Anthony's family members, who provided insight into the toxic nature of the relationship. They spoke with people who'd been at the party on June 13th, who confirmed that Samantha and Anthony had argued after she saw the text messages on his phone. They also uncovered Samantha's prior arrest for domestic violence in 2013. While she hadn't been convicted in that case, the arrest record showed a pattern of violent behavior toward Anthony. It painted a picture of a relationship marked by jealousy, possessiveness, and physical aggression. As the investigation progressed, details about the murder began to emerge publicly. The fact that Samantha had stabbed Anthony 58 times shocked even seasoned law enforcement officers. The mutilation of his body added another layer of horror to an already horrific crime, and the Facebook confession made the case something that transcended the usual boundaries of small-town tragedy. It became a national story, an example of how social media had become intertwined with even the darkest aspects of human behavior. Samantha Stancifer made her first appearance in Okmulgee County District Court on June 25, 2015, just 11 days after the murder. The courtroom was packed with Anthony's family members, including his sister Amanda, his aunt, and others who'd loved him and were still struggling to process the enormity of what had happened. Samantha appeared before the judge, and those who saw her that day noted her demeanor. She seemed disconnected, showing no visible remorse, no tears, no signs of the emotional breakdown one might expect from someone who just killed the person they'd claimed to love. Amanda Feldposch would later tell reporters that Samantha had shown no remorse whatsoever when recounting the events to police, that it hadn't even fazed her to talk about stabbing Anthony to death. Samantha's attorney declined to comment publicly, focusing instead on preparing for what everyone assumed would be a difficult defense. After all, his client had confessed to the murder on Facebook, called 911 to admit to the crime, and been found covered in the victim's blood. The evidence was overwhelming. As the months passed, Samantha remained in custody at the Okmulgee County Jail. The prosecution continued to strengthen their case, gathering witness statements, forensic evidence, and the damning text messages that suggested premeditation. The Fints, meanwhile, faced the challenge of representing a client whose guilt was not in question, but whose actions demanded some form of explanation that might mitigate her sentence. By April 2016, nearly a year after Anthony's death, it became clear that the case would not go to trial. Samantha's attorneys had advised her that given the strength of the evidence against her, her best option was to plead guilty and hope for some leniency in sentencing. Samantha Stancifer pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in the death of Jim Anthony Hall. By entering this plea, she avoided a trial that would have subjected Anthony's family to the painful process of reliving every detail of his murder. But it also meant that she would face the full weight of the justice system's response to her crime. The sentencing hearing took place on a Friday morning, almost exactly a year after Anthony's murder. The courtroom was once again filled with his family and friends, people who'd come to see justice served for a young man whose life had been cut short by violence. District Judge Mike Claver presided over the hearing. He listened as District Attorney Rob Barris laid out the facts of the case, emphasizing the premeditation evidenced by Samantha's text messages and the extreme brutality of the attack. Barris described how Samantha had stabbed Anthony 58 times and slashed his throat to ensure he was dead. He reminded the court that Anthony had been asleep, completely vulnerable, when the attack began. Barris also played portions of the 911 call that Samantha had made after the murder, her flat, emotionless voice admitting to killing her boyfriend. The recording sent chills through the courtroom. When it came time for sentencing, Judge Claver did not mince words. Looking directly at Samantha Stancifer, he announced that she would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And then he added something that captured the sentiment of everyone who'd followed the case. He told Samantha that he was showing her exactly the same mercy she showed to her victim. None. The sentence meant that Samantha, who was just 21 years old at the time of sentencing, would spend the rest of her life behind bars. She would never walk free. She would grow old in prison, her entire adult life confined to a cell, a permanent consequence for a few minutes of murderous rage. For Anthony's family, the sentence brought a measure of closure, though no punishment could truly compensate for their loss. Amanda Feldpausch stood outside the courthouse after the sentencing and spoke to reporters about her brother. She talked about how Anthony had been a good kid, how he tried to help Samantha even after their relationship ended, and how that kindness had cost him his life. The case had attracted national attention, partly because of the Facebook confession that had made it unusual, and partly because of the sheer brutality of the crime. It became one of many examples of how killers in the social media age sometimes confess to their crimes online, sharing their darkest acts with the world in a way that previous generations would never have imagined. In the years since Anthony Hall's murder, his family has had to navigate life without him. His sister Amanda became an advocate for domestic violence awareness, speaking about the warning signs that she'd seen in Anthony's relationship with Samantha. Warning signs that, in hindsight, pointed toward the tragedy that would unfold. The toxic nature of their relationship, the cycle of breaking up and getting back together, Samantha's previous arrest for domestic violence, all of these were red flags that everyone recognized after the fact. But when you're in the middle of it, when it's someone you love making choices you don't agree with, it's hard to know how to intervene effectively. Anthony's death sparked conversations in Henrietta and beyond about domestic violence, about how it affects both women and men, and about the importance of taking threats seriously. The text messages Samantha had sent days before the murder, saying she would either get Anthony jailed or kill him, should have been treated as the serious threat they were. But like so many threats made in the heat of anger, they were likely dismissed as just words, just the drama of a failed relationship. Samantha Stancifer remains incarcerated in Oklahoma's prison system. She is now in her early 30s, serving out a sentence that will end only with her death. There are no news reports of appeals, no efforts to reduce her sentence. She has faded from public consciousness, just another prisoner among thousands. Her brief moment of infamy reduced to a footnote in articles about social media confessions. Henrietta, Oklahoma continues its quiet existence, the kind of small town where this tragedy is remembered by those who lived through it, but where life has moved forward nonetheless. The house on West Dixie Street where Anthony died has likely changed hands, its history unknown to new occupants who have no connection to the violence that occurred within its walls. The murder of Anthony Hall is a story that contains several layers of tragedy. On the most obvious level, it's the story of a young man killed by someone he'd once loved, someone he was trying to help even after their relationship had ended. His kindness, his willingness to let his ex-girlfriend stay at his house during a difficult time, was repaid with unimaginable violence. But it's also a story about toxic relationships, and the difficulty of escaping them. Anthony knew, intellectually, that his relationship with Samantha wasn't healthy. He told his sister as much, but emotional bonds don't break easily, and first loves have a way of keeping their hold on us long after we know we should let go. Anthony tried to maintain some connection with Samantha, tried to help her one last time, and it cost him his life. The case also highlights the dark intersection of social media and crime. Samantha's Facebook confession, "I did it, he deserved it," was a chilling example of how the platforms we use to share our daily lives can also become venues for confessing our darkest deeds. Her post was seen by friends, family members, and strangers, spreading the news of Anthony's murder before police had even finished processing the scene. In a way, social media added another layer of trauma to an already traumatic event, forcing Anthony's loved ones to learn about his death through a public post rather than through proper channels. And finally, it's a story about premeditation disguised as passion. While Samantha's attorneys might have argued that the murder was a crime of passion, committed in the heat of jealous rage, the evidence suggested otherwise. Her text messages from days before the murder, her calm demeanor after the killing, and the systematic brutality of the attack all pointed to someone who had contemplated violence and then carried it out with deliberate intent. The story of Anthony Hall's murder is a reminder of how quickly life can be taken, how a gesture of kindness can turn fatal when offered to the wrong person at the wrong time. It's a story that resonates with anyone who's ever been in a toxic relationship, anyone who's ever ignored warning signs because they wanted to believe in the good in someone they cared about. Anthony was 23 years old when he died, barely into adulthood with his whole life ahead of him. He should have had the chance to find real love, to build a career, to maybe start a family of his own. Instead, his life ended in a bedroom in Henrietta, Oklahoma, at the hands of someone who claimed to love him but whose love had twisted into something dark and possessive, and ultimately deadly. His family still mourns him. His friends still remember the good kid with the kind heart who was always willing to help. And somewhere in an Oklahoma prison, Samantha Stancifer serves out a sentence that will last the rest of her life, paying for those few minutes of violence that destroyed 2 lives. Anthony's ended, hers forever altered. This is where we leave the story of Anthony Hall. As you drift off to sleep, let this tale remind you of the fragility of life, the importance of recognizing danger even when it comes from someone familiar, and the devastating consequences that can follow when jealousy and possessiveness overtake reason. If you're still awake and listening, check whether you've left your little goodnight comment. I always check your comments before I sleep too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight we're going to explore a story that, while tragic, reminds us of the complexities of human relationships and the quiet strength found in small communities. This is the story of Heather Stamper, a young mother from Delaware City whose life was cut short in the summer of 2016. As we move through this narrative, let my voice guide you gently through the details. There's no rush. Just listen, let your eyes grow heavy, and allow yourself to drift as we unfold what happened on those warm July nights in a small Delaware town. Delaware City sits along the banks of the Delaware River, a quiet place where generations of families have built their lives. It's the kind of town where everyone knows everyone, where summer evenings are spent on porches, and where the sound of the river provides a constant soothing backdrop to daily life. In 2016, Heather Lynn Stamper was 31 years old and living on Adams Street in this small community. Born on November 5, 1984, in nearby Wilmington, Heather had grown up in Delaware City, surrounded by her extended family. Her grandparents, Robert and Betty O'Neill, lived close by. She had aunts and uncles scattered throughout the area, and a network of cousins who had been part of her life since childhood. Those who knew Heather remembered her fondness for simple pleasures. She loved to read, losing herself in books during quiet afternoons. She enjoyed taking long walks through the neighborhood, often stopping to admire the gardens that lined the streets. Heather had a particular affection for dolphins, drawn perhaps to their grace and intelligence, and her favorite flowers were pink daisies, their cheerful petals brightening any room. But most importantly, Heather was a mother. Her son, Brian, named after her late uncle, was the center of her world. Friends and family who visited her home on Adams Street would see the evidence of her devotion everywhere. The careful way she organized his things, the stories she read to him, the dreams she harbored for his future. Life, of course, is never simple. By the summer of 2016, Heather found herself in a relationship with a man named Stephen Pierce. He was 45 years old, 14 years her senior, and their relationship had become increasingly complicated in ways that those closest to Heather had begun to notice. Stephen Pierce was not a stranger to trouble. As the summer of 2016 unfolded, dark clouds from his past were gathering. Earlier that year, serious accusations had surfaced. Allegations of sexual abuse involving a minor, physical abuse, and threats made against his wife. Yes, his wife, because even as he was involved with Heather, Pierce remained married to another woman, with whom he had stepchildren. When these accusations came to light, Pierce made a decision that would prove fateful. Rather than face the consequences in Newcastle County, he fled. He moved in with Heather full-time, bringing with him the volatility and violence that had marked his other relationships. It was a pattern, one that law enforcement and the court system would later be criticized for not adequately addressing. Friends who knew Pierce from earlier days, from times when they would cruise the back roads together, drinking and having what seemed like carefree fun, could hardly reconcile that memory with the man he had become. Something had shifted in him over the years, or perhaps something dark had always been there, waiting. By July, the relationship between Heather and Stephen had reached a breaking point. Pierce's jealousy had grown increasingly intense, his suspicions increasingly paranoid. He would watch Heather's phone, monitor her conversations, question her about her past relationships. It was suffocating, controlling, dangerous. The evening of July 8th, 2016, began like many others in Delaware City. The summer heat was finally breaking as the sun set over the Delaware River. But on Clinton Street and nearby Ellesmere, something was unraveling. Witnesses would later report seeing Heather and Stephen together that evening, their voices raised in argument. Whatever Stephen believed he had seen or heard, perhaps a text message from an ex-boyfriend, perhaps something conjured entirely by his jealous imagination, it had sent him into a rage. The argument escalated quickly. Words turned harsh, accusations flew, and in that heated moment, Heather made a decision. She ended the relationship. She told Stephen it was over, that she wouldn't continue living this way, and then she left, returning to her home on Adams Street, likely hoping that would be the end of it. But Stephen Pierce was not done. His anger, rather than cooling, intensified. He drove to a friend's house, his hands trembling with rage. Inside his car, his purple flower seat covers caught his eye, and in a display of violent frustration, he began ripping them apart, tearing at the fabric as if it might release the fury building inside him. His friend watched, concerned, as Pierce made an unsettling request. He wanted to borrow a gun. When asked why, Pierce didn't hide his intentions. He wanted to kill Heather, he said. The words hung in the air, chilling and direct. To that friend's credit, they refused. They would not provide Pierce with a weapon. They watched as he left, still seething, still dangerous, and hoped perhaps that the denial would force him to reconsider, to calm down, to think clearly. But Pierce simply went to another friend's house. There he made the same request, this time adding something that revealed the darker corners of his mind. He asked for two things, a gun and a rosary. The juxtaposition was striking, an instrument of death and a symbol of faith, requested in the same breath, as if he knew the gravity of what he was planning and sought absolution even before committing the act. This is my last night of freedom, Pierce told this second friend. His words were prophetic, resigned. I am going to be a lifer come tomorrow, he knew. In that moment, Stephen Pierce knew exactly what he was about to do. What happened next unfolded in the darkness of early morning on July 9th. Heather had returned home to her residence on Adams Street, likely exhausted from the confrontation, emotionally drained from ending a relationship that had become toxic. She shared the home with a roommate, someone who knew both Heather and Stephen, who had perhaps witnessed the deterioration of their relationship over the months. Pierce had been living there. At some point during those dark hours, Stephen Pierce arrived at the house. The roommate, presumably unaware of the full extent of what had transpired earlier that evening, let him in. Perhaps Pierce seemed calmer. Perhaps he offered some explanation. Perhaps the roommate simply didn't want to create more conflict by turning him away. Pierce made his way to Heather's bedroom, which was located in the basement of the home. Heather, exhausted from the emotional turmoil of the day, had gone to sleep. She was in her most vulnerable state, unaware of the danger that had entered her home. The roommate, trying to maintain some semblance of normal evening routine, was elsewhere in the house when they heard it. A loud bang from the basement. It was the kind of sound that makes your blood run cold, that sends your heart racing even before your mind can process what it might mean. 15 minutes passed. They felt interminable, those 15 minutes, though the roommate didn't yet know why, and then Stephen Pierce emerged from the basement. He was crying, his face contorted with emotion, but the words he spoke seemed disconnected from what had just occurred. We broke up, he told the roommate. I'll never see that bitch again. And then he left. He simply walked out of the house, leaving behind a scene that would soon shatter the quiet of Delaware City. Saturday afternoon, July 9th, at 2:24 p.m., a 911 call came into the Delaware City Police Department. It was Stephen Pierce calling to report that he had found Heather dead. His voice on that call contained just the right notes of distress, confusion, shock. He told the dispatcher he had discovered his girlfriend unresponsive in her bedroom. But even as he made that call, Pierce was already constructing a narrative, one that would quickly fall apart under the scrutiny of trained investigators. Delaware City Police arrived at the home on Adams Street within minutes, accompanied by officers from the Newcastle County Police Department. What they found in Heather's basement bedroom left no doubt. This was a homicide scene. Heather Lynn Stamper lay dead, and the evidence of violence was unmistakable. Pierce, when questioned by the arriving officers, began telling his story. Heather had been suicidal, he claimed. She'd been feeling depressed lately. He said he'd found her with her wrists cut. In some versions of his story, he claimed she had been shot. The details kept shifting, morphing as if he couldn't quite remember which lie he'd decided to tell. Newcastle County Emergency Medical Services pronounced Heather dead at the scene. There would be no rush to the hospital, no desperate attempts at revival. She was gone, and had been for some time. The Delaware Division of Forensic Science was called to process the scene and transport Heather's body for autopsy. Delaware State Police homicide detectives were also contacted, and they assumed control of what was now officially a murder investigation. As the afternoon stretched into evening, investigators began conducting interviews, collecting evidence, and piecing together the timeline of the previous 24 hours. The contradictions in Pierce's story became immediately apparent. The physical evidence at the scene contradicted his claims about suicide. Heather's wrists were not cut. She had not been shot. The manner of death was becoming clear, even before the official autopsy results. The following day, the autopsy confirmed what investigators already suspected. Heather had died from blunt force trauma. Someone had beaten her to death with sufficient force to cause fatal injuries. The pathologist ruled it a homicide, and the manhunt for the truth intensified. Delaware State Police Homicide Unit detectives, working alongside Delaware City Police, began the methodical work of building their case. They conducted interview after interview, speaking with Heather's family, her friends, her roommate, and people who knew Stephen Pierce. The picture that emerged was damning. Witnesses came forward describing the argument on the evening of July 8th. Pierce's friends, troubled by what they'd witnessed, told police about his request for a gun, his stated intention to kill Heather, his ominous prediction about his last night of freedom. The friend who had seen Pierce destroying his car seat covers in rage came forward. Each piece of evidence added weight to what investigators already believed. But perhaps most chilling was what investigators discovered about Pierce's behavior immediately after the murder. He hadn't simply fled or hidden. Instead, he'd engaged in an elaborate performance of grief. He'd called 911, feigning discovery of her body. He'd crafted stories about her suicidal state. And then, in an act of breathtaking audacity, he'd gone to Heather's online obituary and left a comment. Using a pet name he'd called her, Pierce wrote a message asking why someone would take her from him. It was a public display of mourning from the very man who had ended her life. A manipulation so brazen that it speaks to either tremendous arrogance or a complete disconnect from reality. Or perhaps both. Throughout the summer of 2016, Pierce walked free while investigators built their case. They were thorough, knowing that when they arrested him, they needed the evidence to be ironclad. They spoke with his estranged wife, learning about the abuse she and her children had endured. They documented the sexual abuse allegations from earlier in the year. They established his pattern of violence, control, and threats. The investigation took months, but on Friday, October 7th, 2016, nearly 3 months after Heather's death, Delaware State Police detectives arrested Stephen Michael Pierce at his residence. There was no drama, no chase, no resistance. He was taken into custody without incident and transported to Troop 2 in Glasgow for processing. He was charged with murder in the first degree and possession of a deadly weapon during the commission of a felony. At his arraignment at Justice of the Peace Court 2, bail was set at $2,100,000 cash. Pierce was committed to the Howard R. Young Correctional Institution, where he would remain until trial. The wheels of justice, while thorough, turned slowly. It would be nearly 3 years before Stephen Pierce faced trial for Heather's murder. During that time, Heather's family worked to keep her memory alive and to ensure her son Brian would grow up knowing who his mother was. A woman who loved him deeply, who enjoyed simple pleasures, who deserved a life cut far too short. On July 29, 2016, just weeks after her death, family and friends gathered at Dragon Run Park Building on 5th Street in Delaware City to celebrate Heather's life. Instead of flowers, attendees were asked to contribute to the Brian Falcone Education Fund, ensuring that Heather's son would have opportunities for his future. It was a fitting tribute, Heather's love for her son extending beyond her death, securing his path forward. At the memorial, friends shared memories. They talked about growing up with Heather running around Delaware City during those carefree teenage summers. They remembered her smile, her kindness, the way she always welcomed people into her home. One friend recalled that Heather was like a boxer, not in the sense of physical fighting, but in her spirit. She was a fighter, they said, someone who kept pushing forward despite challenges. The trial finally began in April 2019. Deputy Attorneys General Matthew Froley and Jenna Malecki prosecuted the case. Assisted by social worker Stacey Murphy and paralegal Stacey Koo, they presented the evidence methodically, the witnesses who heard Pierce threaten Heather's life, the physical evidence from the scene, the contradictions in Pierce's statements, the pattern of violence in his history. Pierce's defense team had little to work with. The evidence was overwhelming, the timeline clear, the motive established. On the charges of murder in the first degree and possession of a deadly weapon during the commission of a felony, the jury returned guilty verdicts on both counts. On May 24, 2019, nearly 3 years after Heather's death, Stephen Pierce stood before a Superior Court judge for sentencing. The judge, having reviewed the evidence and the circumstances of the crime, handed down a sentence that reflected the gravity of what Pierce had done. Life in prison plus an additional 25 years. At 45 years old, when sentenced, Stephen Pierce would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. There would be no possibility of parole, no chance for redemption in the outside world. His prediction from that night, "I am going to be a lifer come tomorrow," had come true, though it took the legal system 3 years to officially confirm it. As we near the end of this story, let's take a moment to breathe deeply. The tragedy of Heather Stamper's death is not just about the violence that ended her life, but about all the warning signs that preceded it. The abuse allegations, the threat, the pattern of controlling behavior that Pierce exhibited, not just with Heather, but with his wife and stepchildren as well. In the aftermath, questions were raised about whether the system had failed Heather. When Pierce fled Newcastle County to avoid facing sexual abuse charges earlier in 2016, should more have been done to monitor him, to protect potential victims? When he was accused of threatening his wife's life, could intervention have prevented him from forming another relationship where he could exercise the same violent control? These are uncomfortable questions without easy answers. They require us to think about how we as a society address domestic violence, how we support victims, how we hold perpetrators accountable before tragedy strikes rather than after. Delaware City, that quiet town by the river, was forced to confront the reality that violence can intrude anywhere, that danger can wear a familiar face, that the person arguing with their partner on a summer evening might be capable of unthinkable acts. Heather's family was left to raise her son without her, to explain to a young boy why his mother was gone, to try to fill an unfillable void. Her grandparents, Robert and Betty, who had watched her grow up in their community, now had to navigate a grief that no grandparent should face. Her aunts and uncles, her cousins, her friends, all carried forward the weight of her loss. But they also carried forward her memory. They remembered the girl who loved to read, who took long walks, who adored dolphins and pink daisies. They remembered the mother who devoted herself to her son's well-being. They remembered Heather not as a victim, but as a complete person whose life mattered, whose presence left an imprint on everyone who knew her. In that memorial gathering at Dragon Run Park, in the contributions made to ensure Brian's education, in the small acts of remembrance that continue years later, Heather's community chose to honor her life rather than let it be defined solely by how it ended. And so we come to the end of Heather's story. A young mother, taken far too soon by someone she had trusted, someone she had let into her life and her home. A community shaken by violence, but rallying to support those left behind. A justice system that, while slow, ultimately held her killer accountable. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that every true crime story is fundamentally a story about real people. People with hopes and dreams, with families who loved them, with lives that mattered. Heather Lynn Stamper was more than the circumstances of her death. She was a daughter, a mother, a granddaughter, a friend. She loved pink daisies and dolphins. She read books and took walks. She was someone's whole world. Let your breathing deepen now. Let the weight of the day settle away from you. Tomorrow will come, with all its possibilities. But tonight, as you rest, hold on to the things that matter, the connections we make, the love we share, the small kindnesses that make life worthwhile. Heather's story reminds us to pay attention to warning signs, to believe victims when they speak up, to hold dangerous people accountable before tragedy strikes. But it also reminds us that love persists beyond death, that communities can heal, and that justice, however delayed, can eventually arrive. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. The late summer nights in Texas carry a particular kind of warmth. In August of 2014, the Shops at Legacy in Plano was the kind of place where young professionals gathered after work, where friends reconnected over drinks and laughter. It was a carefully designed complex where apartments sat above trendy restaurants and boutiques, where parking garages connected everything together. On the night of August 29th, it seemed like any other Friday. Christina Morris was 23 years old that summer. She had grown up in Plano, attended Allen High School, and knew these streets well. By 2014, she had moved to Fort Worth with her boyfriend, Hunter Foster. But her roots remained in Plano. Her friends were there. Her memories were there. And on that particular Friday night, she had plans to meet up with one of her closest friends from high school. Paulina Petrosky lived at the Shops at Legacy, in one of those apartments that overlooked the busy complex below. She had invited several friends from their Allen High School days to gather at her place, before heading out to a bar. It was Labor Day weekend, and the timing felt right for a reunion. Christina made the drive from Fort Worth, excited for a night out with old friends. The group that gathered that evening included familiar faces from their teenage years. Among them was Enrique Gutierrez Arochi, someone they'd known from high school. He was 24, just a year older than Christina. They weren't particularly close, but they moved in the same social circles. That night, he was just another face in the group, someone to share drinks and memories with. The evening unfolded the way these nights often do. They talked, they laughed, they reminisced about high school. Around midnight, they decided to head to a nearby bar. The complex made it easy to stay close, everything within walking distance. They spent a few hours at the bar, the conversation flowing as freely as the drinks. By 3 in the morning, people were starting to think about heading home. Christina's car was parked in one of the parking garages at the complex. So was Enrique's. Around 3:30 in the morning, as the group was winding down back at Paulina's apartment, Christina said her goodbyes. She was ready to make the drive back to Fort Worth. Enrique left at the same time. It seemed coincidental. 2 people heading to their cars parked in the same garage. The parking structure at the Shops at Legacy was equipped with security cameras. These cameras captured something that would later become the most important piece of evidence in what was about to unfold. At 3:55 a.m., Christina Morris and Enrique Arochi were seen walking together up the ramps of the parking garage. They appeared to be talking, moving at a casual pace. The footage showed them disappearing deeper into the structure. A few minutes later, the cameras captured Enrique's black Chevrolet Camaro, leaving the garage. His car exited, but Christina's car remained where she had parked it hours earlier, and Christina Morris was never seen alive again. The first days after Christina disappeared moved slowly for her family. When Saturday passed without word from her, her father, Mark Morris, wasn't immediately alarmed. Christina was an adult, after all. Maybe her phone had died. Maybe she'd stayed longer with friends than planned. But as Saturday turned into Sunday and Sunday into Monday, the silence became deafening. On Tuesday, September 2nd, 4 days after anyone had heard from Christina, Mark Morris called the police to report his daughter missing. He described her calmly at first, trying to convince himself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Christina was responsible. She kept in touch with her family. This wasn't like her. The Plano Police Department began investigating immediately. They started with the basics, retracing Christina's last known movements. When they learned she'd been at the Shops at Legacy that Friday night, they requested surveillance footage from the complex. What they found changed everything. The video of Christina and Enrique walking into that parking garage became the turning point. Christina's car was still there, untouched. But the cameras told a story that didn't match what Enrique had told his girlfriend that night. His phone records told another story entirely. When investigators first spoke with Enrique Orochi, his account seemed straightforward enough. He said he'd walked with Christina toward the parking area, but they'd separated before reaching their cars. He'd gone his way. She'd gone hers. He assumed she'd driven home safely. It was a simple explanation, the kind that might have been believable under different circumstances. But the surveillance footage contradicted his story. The camera showed them walking into the garage together, not separating beforehand. And there was something else. Cell phone records showed that both Christina's phone and Enrique's phone had pinged off the same cell tower at nearly the same time that morning, suggesting they'd traveled together, at least for a while. As investigators dug deeper, they began speaking with the other friends who'd been out that night. One of them, Sabrina Boss, shared something that caught the attention of detectives. Earlier in the evening, back at Paulina's apartment, Enrique had made advances towards Sabrina. She'd rejected him. According to Sabrina, Enrique had left the apartment angrily after the rejection, and Christina had happened to leave at the same time. The investigation expanded. Detectives spoke with Enrique's co-workers at the Sprint store where he worked. Their testimony painted a troubling picture of the morning after Christina disappeared. Enrique had shown up to work 3 hours late on Saturday, August 30th. When he arrived, his co-workers noticed something immediately. His hands and arms were covered in scratches and bruises. One co-worker, Jacob Talamantes, specifically remembered a mark on Enrique's arm that looked like a bite mark. When asked about his injuries, Enrique offered different explanations to different people. To one co-worker, he said his car's rim had fallen on him while he was changing a tire. To others, he claimed he'd gotten into a fight at the shops at Legacy. The inconsistency was notable. Why would someone give varying explanations for the same injuries? Investigators obtained a warrant to search Enrique's car, the black Camaro that had been captured on camera leaving the parking garage that morning. What they found during that search would become the cornerstone of the case against him. But first, there was something else that caught their attention. A detective named Fred Garcia was assigned to install a GPS tracking device on Enrique's vehicle. The hope was that Enrique might lead them to wherever Christina was. Garcia had installed dozens of tracking devices on vehicles over his career. But when he slid under Enrique's Camaro to find a suitable mounting spot, something struck him as unusual. His hand came out clean, completely clean. In all his years of working on vehicles, even brand new cars on dealer lots, he'd never encountered an undercarriage that clean. It was, in his words, better than showroom condition. There was also surveillance footage from a gas station in Allen, captured about 6 hours after Christina was last seen. The video showed Enrique using a squeegee to clean the back of his Camaro, paying particular attention to the bumper and rear section of the car. It wasn't the kind of behavior one typically sees at a gas station in the early morning hours. When investigators searched Enrique's home, they found cleaning supplies, lots of them. Bottles of multi-surface cleaner, Autobahn, a product used to eliminate odors, black Gorilla Tape, and a small handwritten note on a post-it, written in bullet points. Black shirt, text messages, bank bills. To prosecutors, it looked like a to-do list of evidence to dispose of. To the defense, it was a list of items Enrique was gathering to help prove his innocence. The interpretation would become a matter of debate, but the most damning evidence came from the trunk of that Camaro. Crime scene analysts used a chemical compound called Blue Star, which reacts to the presence of blood, even trace amounts that have been cleaned. 2 areas of the trunk mat lit up under the Blue Star application. These samples were sent to the UNT Center for Human Identification for DNA testing. The results came back in December of 2014. Christina Morris's DNA was found on the trunk mat and on the rubber liner around the trunk lid. The DNA expert who testified later at trial explained that this wasn't the kind of DNA you'd expect from casual contact. It suggested a more significant source, likely a bodily fluid. The probability that the DNA belonged to someone other than Christina was calculated at 1 in 1.7 quintillion. Christina's father would later testify that his daughter would never have climbed into the trunk of a car willingly. Several friends and family members confirmed that Christina was afraid of the dark and would never have walked alone at night. For someone who was claustrophobic and frightened of confined dark spaces, being in the trunk of a car would have been a nightmare. On December 13th, 2014, nearly 4 months after Christina disappeared, Enrique Arochi was arrested and charged with aggravated kidnapping. The charge was significant because no body had been found. The prosecution would have to build their case entirely on circumstantial evidence, surveillance footage, forensic evidence, and the inconsistencies in Enrique's statements. The trial began in September of 2016, almost exactly 2 years after Christina vanished. It lasted for days, with testimony from 73 witnesses and over 300 exhibits presented to the jury. The prosecution laid out their theory methodically. Christina and Enrique had walked to the parking garage together. At some point, something had gone wrong. There had been a physical altercation. Christina had fought back, which explained Enrique's injury. She had ended up in the trunk of his car, whether by force or because she was already incapacitated. The defense argued that there was no direct evidence. No witnesses had seen what happened in that parking garage. No one could definitively say what had occurred after the surveillance cameras lost sight of them. Enrique maintained his innocence, insisting that he and Christina had parted ways peacefully. But the accumulation of circumstantial evidence was powerful. The DNA in the trunk, the cleaned undercarriage of the car, the injuries on Enrique's body, the lies he'd told to his girlfriend about where he'd been that night, the different explanations he'd given coworkers about his injuries, the cell phone records that contradicted his account of events, the damage to his car's front fender, which an accident reconstruction expert testified was consistent with striking something soft, like a person's body. There were other details that emerged during the trial. Investigators had found pornographic images on Enrique's phone, disturbing content depicting violence against women. They found a notebook in his bedroom with a list of things to work on, and at the top of that list was "Stop lying." There was even testimony about an olive jar found in his room that investigators believed it might be related to hekizo, or witchcraft, though the judge ultimately ruled this line of inquiry inadmissible. Throughout the trial, Christina's family sat in the courtroom, searching Enrique's face for any sign of remorse, any hint of where their daughter might be. Her mother, Johnny McElroy, had moved from Tulsa, Oklahoma to Texas to search for Christina full-time. She'd lost her job in the process. Her father, Mark, had never stopped looking. Her stepmother, Anna, attended every day of the trial. They all wore purple, Christina's favorite color. On September 27, 2016, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty of aggravated kidnapping. 3 days later, Judge Mark Rush sentenced Enrique Arochi to life in prison. He would be eligible for parole in 30 years, in the year 2044. Before Enrique was led away, the judge allowed Christina's family to address him directly. One by one, they approached the witness stand. They begged him to tell them where Christina was. They pleaded with him to do the right thing, to give them the closure of knowing where their daughter lay. Enrique sat silently, looking down, offering nothing. He was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, still maintaining his innocence, still refusing to provide any answers. The years that followed were marked by ongoing searches. Team Christina, a group of volunteers who had formed in the days after Christina's disappearance, continued to comb through areas of North Texas. They searched fields, wooded areas, anywhere that might hold a clue. The family never gave up hope of bringing Christina home. Then, in March of 2018, nearly 4 years after Christina disappeared, workers clearing land for new home construction in Anna, Texas, made a discovery in a wooded, secluded area about 40 miles from Plano. They found human remains. A skull was visible on a hillside, near what appeared to be a woman's dress and undergarments. The area where the remains were found was one that investigators had searched before, in the years after Christina vanished, but the thick brush and difficult terrain had made thorough searches challenging. Now, as the land was being cleared, what had been hidden for so long was finally revealed. Forensic investigators used dental records to confirm what the family both feared and needed to know. The remains were Christina Morris. After 1,285 days of searching, of hoping, of refusing to give up, Christina had been found. The discovery was bittersweet. At a press conference, Christina's sister Sarah Estes spoke through tears. "We made a promise to Christina that we would find her and bring her home," she said. The family's statement reflected the complicated emotions of that moment. "Our hearts are irreversibly broken. We never wanted closure, even if there is such a thing. We only wanted Christina. Because of the advanced state of decomposition, medical examiners could not determine a cause of death. This meant that while Enrique Orochi was serving life in prison for kidnapping, he had never been charged with murder. The legal complexities were significant. He'd already been convicted of kidnapping Christina, trying him again for murder. Using the kidnapping as an aggravating factor for a capital murder charge could potentially constitute double jeopardy. Still, the location where Christina's remains were found provided one more piece of evidence against Enrique. Cell phone records showed that his phone had pinged off towers near that exact location in the hours after Christina disappeared. The evidence had always pointed to him. Now, even in death, Christina's final resting place confirmed what investigators had long believed. In December of 2016, before Christina's remains were found, Enrique Orochi gave an interview from prison. He maintained his innocence. He said he hoped Christina was alive. He said he felt he'd been the victim of harassment and prejudice. He said his faith in God had grown stronger, and that he prayed every morning. He said he would continue fighting to clear his name. When Christina's stepmother Anna heard about the interview, her response was simple. It's the same story he gave before, poor me. I don't think any of what he has to say deserves a response. Enrique appealed his conviction, arguing that the trial should have been moved out of Collin County due to pretrial publicity, and that the evidence against him was insufficient. In 2018, the appellate court affirmed his conviction. They found that he had not proven the media coverage was prejudicial, and they noted that Enrique himself had given multiple interviews to television, radio, and print media, sharing his own version of events with the public. To this day, Enrique Orochi remains in prison, serving his life sentence for the aggravated kidnapping of Christina Morris. He has never been charged with her murder. He has never told her family what happened that night in the parking garage, or why Christina ended up in the trunk of his car, or how she came to rest in that field in Anna, Texas. The case of Christina Morris became a landmark in Texas criminal justice. It was one of the first aggravated kidnapping cases in the state to result in a conviction without a body. The precedent it set would later help prosecutors in other missing persons cases, including the case of Tiffany Johnson, another woman who disappeared under suspicious circumstances. For Christina's family, the discovery of her remains brought a measure of peace, even as it confirmed their worst fears. They could finally lay her to rest. They could visit a grave, a physical place to remember her, but the questions that haunt them exactly what happened in those early morning hours. Why Enrique did what he did, whether Christina suffered, those questions may never be answered. The shops at Legacy continues to bustle with activity. People live in those apartments, shop in those stores, park in those garages. Most are probably unaware of the tragedy that unfolded there one late summer night. But for those who knew Christina Morris, for her family who still wears purple in her honor, for the investigators who worked tirelessly to find her, that parking garage will always hold a story of a young woman whose life was stolen from her, and a mystery that was solved through persistence, forensic science, and the refusal of those who loved her to ever give up. Christina was 23 years old. She loved the color purple. She was afraid of the dark and of tight spaces. She had a family who adored her, friends who remembered her smile, and a life full of possibilities ahead of her. What happened to her in that parking garage in the early hours of August 30, 2014, robbed her of all of that. And somewhere in a Texas prison, Enrique Orochi knows the truth of those final moments. But he has chosen silence, a silence that will likely last for the rest of his life, or until his conscience can no longer bear the weight of what he knows. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight we're going back to the spring of 2015, to San Antonio, Texas, where a young mother's spontaneous road trip would end in tragedy. This is a story about trust misplaced, about the dangerous intersection of digital connection and real-world vulnerability, and about a family's 8-year wait for answers. It was Easter weekend, April 2015. The Texas sun hung warm in the sky, and the highway stretched long and inviting for 23-year-old Courtney Phillips. Life was a series of adventures waiting to happen. Those who knew her best described her as spontaneous, outgoing, energetic, the kind of person who could light up a room simply by walking into it. This is the story of Courtney Phillips. San Antonio is a beautiful city, the Riverwalk winding through downtown, the Alamo standing as a testament to history, the vibrant culture mixing Mexican and Texan traditions into something uniquely its own. But Courtney and her friend weren't coming for the tourist attractions. They were just coming to get away, to have some fun, to see where the weekend would take them. Courtney had a 5-year-old son named Jace, and she was working toward building a better life for both of them. Originally from the Dallas area, specifically Arlington, Courtney had that restless spirit that made her crave new experiences, new places, new people. She wasn't reckless, but she wasn't cautious either. She lived with an openness that most of us lose somewhere along the way. That Easter weekend, Courtney decided to take a spontaneous road trip. She and a friend climbed into a car and headed southwest. Destination San Antonio. A few hundred miles of highway, windows down, music playing. For Courtney, this was nothing out of the ordinary. She was young, free, and always ready for the next adventure. In the days leading up to the trip, Courtney had been active on social media. As most young people are, she'd been chatting with someone new, a young man in San Antonio. His name was Isaac Estrada, and he was 19 years old. They'd connected online, exchanged messages, made plans. He seemed nice enough through the screen of a phone. They agreed to meet up for a date while Courtney was in town. To Courtney, this probably felt perfectly normal. Meeting people online had become common, even expected. A quick conversation, some shared interests, plans to grab coffee or go for a walk. She had no reason to think this would be any different. But Isaac Estrada was different. Very different. The house where Courtney was dropped off wasn't Isaac Estrada's home. He didn't live there. In fact, the homeowners were out of town that weekend, completely unaware that their house was being used as a meeting place. How Estrada had access to this house remains unclear. Whether he knew the owners, whether he'd broken in, or whether he'd obtained a key through some other means. But he'd chosen this location deliberately, arranging for Courtney to meet him at a place where they would be completely alone. Courtney's friend dropped her off at an address in the 2000 block of Edge Avenue, on the southeast side of San Antonio. It was a residential neighborhood not far from Goliad Road and Pecan Valley Drive. Working class homes, quiet streets. The kind of place where people know their neighbors. The date was April 5th, 2015. Easter Sunday, the day of resurrection, of hope, of new beginnings. Across San Antonio, families were gathering for holiday dinners. Children were hunting for eggs. Churches were celebrating. Text messages on Courtney's phone would later reveal the careful planning that had gone into this meeting. She and Estrada had coordinated the time, the place. She told him when her friend would drop her off. She had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. She was simply going on a date with someone she'd met online. Something millions of people do safely every day. But from the moment Courtney walked through that door, she was in danger. Courtney's friend, after dropping her off, went about their own business. Hours passed. Evening came. The friend tried to reach Courtney, calls, texts, messages. Nothing. No response. The silence stretched from concerning to alarming. The friend drove back to the house on Edge Avenue. Something felt wrong. They got out of the car and approached the house. Through a window, they could see inside. And what they saw made them immediately dial 911. When San Antonio police officers arrived at the house on Edge Avenue that Easter evening, they encountered a scene that would stay with them for years. Officer Doug Green would later describe it simply. She had multiple stab wounds. She was face down on the floor. Courtney was on the floor. Unresponsive. Not moving. But the crime scene told a much more brutal story. Blood had splattered across multiple rooms. There were signs of violence from a back bedroom, through a hallway, to where Courtney's body lay. She had been stabbed 6 times, in the neck, in the back. The attack had been vicious, sustained, personal. Detective Mark Duke and Detective Lawrence Sazel were assigned to the case. As they processed the scene, a clear picture emerged. This wasn't self-inflicted. This wasn't an accident. This was murder, and it had been brutal. Detective Sazel would later use a specific term to describe what he saw. Overkill. The level of violence went beyond what was necessary to kill someone. It spoke of rage, of something dark and uncontrolled. Courtney Phillips had lost a tremendous amount of blood. She had died where she fell. Her life, all the spontaneity, all the energy, all the plans for a better future with her son, had ended on the floor of a stranger's house on Easter Sunday. Investigators found Courtney's phone. They found her purse, and in examining her phone, they quickly identified the last person she had been in contact with: Isaac Estrada. As detectives dug deeper into Isaac Estrada's background, they discovered something chilling. Courtney Phillips wasn't his first victim. The 19-year-old was immediately named as the prime suspect. Every piece of evidence pointed to him. The text messages arranging the meeting, the location he'd chosen, his complete disappearance immediately after the murder. But when police went to find him, Isaac Estrada was already gone. Just 3 months before Courtney's murder, Estrada had been charged with aggravated robbery. The details of that earlier case were disturbingly similar. He had connected with a woman, arranged to meet her under the pretext of a date, lured her to a location, and then attacked and robbed her. The difference was that this first victim had been able to escape. She had survived. The pattern was clear and calculated. Estrada was using online dating and social media as a hunting ground. He would present himself as a potential romantic interest, arrange a meeting in a location where he had control, and then attack. Whether robbery had been his primary motive in Courtney's case, or whether something had escalated beyond his original plan, the result was the same. A young mother was dead, and her killer had vanished. Crime reporter Yami Virgin, who covered the case extensively for San Antonio media, asked the question that haunted investigators. It was a gruesome crime scene. If he didn't know her personally, if he didn't have a beef with her already, why would it be so brutal? Why would he take that amount of anger out on a person he had never met? But these were questions that couldn't be answered because Isaac Estrada had disappeared like smoke. In the days and weeks following Courtney's murder, a massive investigation unfolded. The San Antonio Police Department dedicated significant resources to finding Isaac Estrada. The U.S. Marshals Lone Star Fugitive Task Force joined the hunt. By October 2015, just 6 months after the murder, the case was elevated to major case status with the U.S. Marshals Service, a designation reserved for the most serious fugitive cases. The violence of the attack suggested something beyond a simple robbery gone wrong. It spoke to something deeper, darker, more disturbing in Estrada's psychology. Investigators traced Estrada's movements through his cell phone records. The data showed that he had fled west, all the way to California. His brother lived in Paris, California, a city about 70 miles southeast of Los Angeles in Riverside County. The marshals tracked him there, obtained information that he was staying at his brother's residence, and moved in to arrest him. Where did Isaac Estrada go from California? How did he survive? How did he evade capture for so long? These questions would remain unanswered for years. But when they arrived, Estrada was gone. According to the marshals, they had missed him by only 1 week. He had been there. And then he'd vanished again. It was a frustrating near miss that would set the tone for the years to come. What authorities did know was that Estrada had certain characteristics that might help identify him. He was known to use marijuana, and possibly abused prescription medications like Xanax. He was young, adaptable, and clearly willing to stay hidden no matter the cost. Back in San Antonio, Courtney's family was left to pick up the pieces. Her 5-year-old son, Jace, was now without his mother. A family friend named Rachel Baird stepped forward to raise the boy. She remembered the phone call that Easter Sunday, the moment their lives changed forever. It was Easter Sunday when we got the phone call that she had traveled to San Antonio with a friend and this had happened. For Jace, the loss was incomprehensible. At 5 years old, how do you understand that your mother is never coming home? As he grew older, the fear evolved. Rachel Baird later recalled, when he was younger, he didn't know if someone was going to hurt him. Now that he is older, he's just been worrying about other people. Time moved forward, as it always does, indifferent to grief. 2015 became 2016. 2016 became 2017. The seasons changed. Years accumulated, and still Isaac Estrada remained a ghost. The case didn't disappear, though. The U.S. Marshals continued to work leads. Rewards were offered. San Antonio Crime Stoppers put up $5,000 for information leading to Estrada's whereabouts. The case was broadcast nationwide. It appeared in various true crime forums, on missing persons websites, in law enforcement bulletins, and always there was the question, would Isaac Estrada ever be found? But the most significant publicity came in September 2021, when the case was featured on the investigation Discovery television show In Pursuit with John Walsh. John Walsh, famous for his decades of work helping to capture fugitives, highlighted Courtney's murder and the ongoing search for Isaac Estrada in season 3 of the show. But weeks passed, months passed, and Isaac Estrada remained free. The episode brought renewed attention to the case. Tips came in from across the country. People who thought they might have seen Estrada called hotlines. The family dared to hope that this exposure would finally bring answers. For Rachel Baird and young Jace, the waiting was agonizing, as Jace grew from a 5-year-old child into a teenager. The fear that Estrada would never be found grew stronger. As time went on, we were just so afraid they weren't going to have the information they needed to find him, Baird recalled. People change their appearance over time. You change a lot from 19 to 26 years old. So we wondered if he would be found. The family tried to move forward while carrying the weight of unresolved justice. Jace grew up without his mother, celebrated birthdays and holidays marked by her absence, and lived with the knowledge that the person responsible for her death was somewhere out there, living his life. 8 years passed. 8 springs came and went. 8 Easters for the family. Each April 5th was the anniversary of loss, a reminder of the day Courtney's life was stolen from her. And then in March 2023, everything changed. On March 4th, 2023, members of the U.S. Marshals Lone Star Fugitive Task Force, working in coordination with officials from Customs and Border Protection, moved in on a location in Eagle Pass. Their target, a 26-year-old man who had been on the run for nearly 8 years. Eagle Pass, Texas sits right on the Mexican border, directly across from Piedras Negras, Coahuila. It's a small city of about 30,000 people, known primarily as a port of entry and as the seat of Maverick County. The Rio Grande winds past the city, marking the international boundary. U.S. Marshal Susan Pemelo spoke to the media about the arrest. Violent criminals prey on the innocent, ending lives and shattering the neighborhoods around them. From the police officers who responded to the initial call, to the deputy U.S. Marshals who tracked Estrada down and arrested him. Each professional within our team is dedicated to ending violence and putting criminals behind bars. This case shows that no matter how far you run, you will be found. You will be arrested, and our communities will be more safe. How had he ended up in Eagle Pass? What had he been doing for 8 years? Had he been in Texas the whole time, or had he only recently returned from somewhere else? These details remain somewhat murky. What is clear is that the long hunt was finally over. Isaac Estrada was taken into custody without incident. The fugitive who had evaded capture across 2 states in 8 years was finally in handcuffs. The news reached Rachel Baird and Jace on March 6th. What would have been Courtney's 31st birthday? Catalyst 5. The local CBS affiliate broke the news to the family. The timing was both painful and perfect. A birthday gift 8 years late, arriving on the day Courtney would have turned 31. For Jace, now 13 years old, the emotions were complex. When asked how he felt about the arrest, he could only say, "Good, emotional." Rachel Baird's first words captured the family's relief. With today being her birthday and us getting the news, it's just answered prayers. After 8 years of wondering, of waiting, of fearing that justice would never come, the man accused of killing his mother was finally behind bars. Isaac Estrada was charged with first-degree capital murder, first-degree aggravated robbery, and the misdemeanor of evading arrest. His bond was set at $85,000. He was held at the Bexar County Adult Detention Center as the case moved toward trial. But as the legal process unfolded, new and disturbing details emerged about what had happened on that Easter Sunday in 2015. Prosecutors revealed that Estrada hadn't just killed Courtney Phillips. He had bragged about it. He had told others about the murder, describing how he had watched her die. The callousness of this detail struck everyone involved in the case. This wasn't someone who had killed in a moment of passion and then felt remorse. This was someone who took pride in what he had done. Initially, Estrada planned to plead guilty to the charges against him, but as the case progressed, negotiations led to a plea deal. In July 2024, nearly a decade after Courtney's murder, Isaac Estrada stood before 290th District Court, visiting Judge Laura Parker. Judge Parker sentenced him to 35 years in prison for murder and an additional 5 years for aggravated robbery. The sentences would run concurrently, meaning Estrada would serve the longer of the two terms. Under Texas law, he would be eligible for parole after serving half of his sentence, meaning he could potentially be released after 17.5 years. As part of the plea agreement, the capital murder charge was reduced to murder. It was a concession that likely disappointed Courtney's family, but it guaranteed a conviction without the uncertainty of a trial. Estrada accepted the deal. How do you measure the adequacy of such an apology? How do you weigh "I'm sorry" against the loss of a mother? Against 8 years of a child growing up alone? Against the fear and uncertainty and grief that Courtney's family had endured? At the sentencing hearing, Isaac Estrada was given the opportunity to speak. He turned to face Courtney's family members in the courtroom. People he had never met, people whose lives he had irrevocably changed, and offered an apology. "I'd like to say sorry to the family. I'm sorry." 2 words. 9 letters. 8 years and 4 months late. There is no scale that can balance that equation. But justice is a strange thing. It can punish the guilty, but it cannot restore what was taken. It cannot bring Courtney Phillips back to life. It cannot give Jace his mother back. It cannot undo the trauma of finding a friend's body, or of spending 8 years wondering if the killer would ever face consequences. Isaac Estrada is now an inmate in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice System. He will spend the next several years, possibly decades, behind bars. The case is closed. The fugitive has been captured. Justice, in the legal sense, has been served. Courtney Phillips was 23 years old when she died. She had a whole life ahead of her, decades of experiences, of growth, of love, of watching her son grow up. All of that potential was erased in a few minutes of violence on Easter Sunday, 2015. Rachel Baird, who took on the responsibility of raising Jace, has had to be both guardian and comforter, helping a child process an impossible loss while dealing with her own grief. She remembered Courtney as beautiful, energetic, working toward a better life. Those memories are all that remain now. Memories and photographs in the aching space where a person used to be. Her son Jace is now a teenager. He has had to grow up without his mother, raised by a family friend who stepped up when tragedy struck. He has had to navigate adolescence with the knowledge that his mother was murdered, that her killer walked free for 8 years, that the justice system moved slowly while he waited for answers. The house on Edge Avenue is just a house again. The blood has been cleaned up, the crime scene tape has been removed. Life has moved on. The families who live on that street probably don't think about what happened there on Easter Sunday, 2015. But for Courtney's family, that address will always be significant. The last place she was alive, the place where everything changed. Isaac Estrada's motives remain somewhat unclear. Why did he target these women? Was it primarily for robbery? Was there a sexual component? Was it something else entirely, some darker impulse that we can't fully understand? The brutality of Courtney's murder, described by investigators as overkill, suggests something beyond simple robbery. But we may never know the full truth of what happened in that house. What we do know is this: the intersection of online connectivity and real-world danger created the opportunity for this tragedy. Courtney Phillips made the same choice millions of people make every day. She agreed to meet someone she'd connected with online. For most people, that choice is harmless. But sometimes the person on the other side of the screen is not who they claim to be. Sometimes they're hunting. This case also reminds us of the limitations of our justice system. Isaac Estrada evaded capture for 8 years despite being on the U.S. Marshals major case list, despite nationwide publicity, despite significant resources devoted to finding him. He was able to disappear and stay disappeared, leaving a family without closure, a child without a mother, and questions without answers. It was only through persistent work by law enforcement, eventually aided by cooperation with border protection agencies, that he was finally captured. And so Courtney Phillips' story ends where it began, with a young woman who was spontaneous, outgoing, full of life. who took a road trip one Easter weekend and never came home. Her life was cut short by violence. But her memory lives on in the people who loved her, in the son who carries her DNA and her legacy, and in the cautionary tale her death tells us about trust, danger, and the sometimes terrible price of being open to new experiences. Rest easy, Courtney Phillips. Your story has been told. Your killer has been caught. And though justice came late, it came. May you find peace wherever you are. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care.